Emily Harper had always wanted a calm life, especially after moving to Seattle to heal from a painful breakup, and she believed her new job at a small publishing company would finally give her the peace she needed, until Daniel Carter, the new author the company had signed, walked in and quietly disrupted the balance she had fought so hard to build. From the moment she first saw him, his calm voice, warm smile, and polished wedding ring, Emily sensed trouble she never asked for, and yet something about him drew her attention before she could stop herself. Daniel wasn't the type of man who tried to be charming, but his presence felt gentle, familiar, and inviting, and Emily noticed the way he remembered small things about her, her coffee order, the way she tapped her pen when she was thinking, how she liked sunlight by her desk. She told herself it meant nothing, but deep down she knew most coworkers weren't this observant, especially not married ones. Daniel often stayed a little longer after meetings, sometimes pretending to fix his notes or ask simple questions, but Emily could always see the real reason in his eyes. He just wanted those few extra minutes with her. She tried to ignore the growing pull between them, reminding herself again and again that he had a wife named Claire, a life outside this office, a ring he wore every day, but Daniel somehow kept appearing in her day in small, unexpected ways that made her heart stumble. He would walk by her desk only to say something funny, offer to help with manuscripts that weren't his responsibility, or ask how she was doing with a softness that felt too personal for two people who were supposed to be nothing more than coworkers. Emily didn't want to encourage anything, so she kept a polite distance, answering briefly, working quickly, avoiding long moments of silence, but Daniel always managed to break through her defenses with small, thoughtful gestures. One quiet evening, long after most employees had gone home, Emily stayed to finish editing a book for a deadline, hoping to enjoy the stillness of the nearly empty office, until she heard soft footsteps and looked up to see Daniel standing by her door. The building was almost dark except for the warm desk lamp beside her, and the moment she saw him she felt her heart tighten with a mix of worry and something she didn't want to name. "You're still here?" he asked softly, stepping closer, his voice lower than usual, making the quiet room feel even heavier. She nodded and kept her eyes on the manuscript, trying not to let her thoughts wander. Daniel walked closer, pulling a chair and sitting on the other side of her desk, as if he had every right to be there. "Emily," he said, and the way he said her name made her realize how much she had started to care. "You make my days feel different." Emily's breath caught, and she looked away quickly, knowing the line between right and wrong was getting blurry. "Daniel," she whispered, "you shouldn't say things like that." His expression softened, regret mixing with sincerity. "I know," he admitted, "but I can't seem to help it." She could feel the weight of the moment pressing between them, a moment she didn't want but couldn't walk away from either. Emily wasn't someone who enjoyed risky feelings. She had been hurt before, lied to, left behind, and she promised herself she would never fall into a situation that could harm someone else. But Daniel wasn't acting like a man who wanted to harm anyone. He looked like someone carrying emotions he didn't understand, someone trying to find clarity in the wrong place. As he leaned back slightly, watching her with quiet intensity, Emily's heart reminded her that feelings often appear without permission, but choices always belong to her. She knew she needed to stop this before it went too far, before either of them said something they couldn't take back, but before she could find the words, Daniel stood up slowly, walked to the door as if he were leaving, and then paused. Looking back at her with a troubled expression that told her more than any confession could. "I didn't plan to feel this way," he said quietly, almost to himself. "But I can't deny it anymore." She didn't respond, not because she agreed, and not because she disagreed, but because the room suddenly felt too small for the truth hanging between them. Then, without another word, he walked out of the office, leaving a silence that felt louder than any conversation they had ever shared. Emily sat there, staring at the manuscript she could no longer focus on, realizing that something had shifted, something she couldn't undo, and as she closed her laptop and turned off the lights, she whispered to herself that she needed distance, clarity, and strength. But the next morning, when she walked into the office hoping things would return to normal, she froze the moment she saw Daniel standing by her desk, waiting, watching, and clearly unable to stay away. And Emily, despite every warning her heart whispered, knew deep down that this was only the beginning of a complicated story she wasn't ready for. After the evening when Daniel lingered too long in Emily's office, the days that followed felt like a delicate trap neither of them wanted but couldn't escape. Daniel started showing up more often, always with excuses that seemed innocent on the surface, questions about manuscripts, discussions about publishing strategies, or even simple comments about the weather, but Emily noticed the pattern, the way his presence made her heart beat faster and her thoughts scatter. She told herself repeatedly that they were only co-workers, that he had a wife and she had no right to be part of his life, yet each small interaction pulled them closer, making it impossible to maintain the boundaries she tried so hard to keep. One rainy afternoon, he invited her to walk with him to a nearby cafe after work, claiming he needed fresh air and someone to share ideas about a project, but Emily felt the tension between them growing with every step, aware that this walk was more about emotional connection than any professional need. The rain fell softly, tapping on the umbrella above them, as they spoke about everything except work, revealing childhood memories, hopes for the future, fears, favorite books, and secret little habits they never shared with anyone else. Emily felt herself opening up in ways she hadn't with anyone in years, and she realized how dangerously easy it was to care about him, to trust him, to enjoy his company. Daniel, meanwhile, was struggling with the weight of his own life. His marriage to Claire had become routine, distant, and quiet, lacking the warmth he found in Emily's presence, and yet he felt guilty even acknowledging it. "Does your wife ever get jealous?" Emily asked cautiously, curious but hesitant, fearing the answer might destroy what little peace remained in her mind. Daniel lowered his gaze, fidgeting slightly with his hands, and admitted that he and Claire hadn't talked like they used to, that their lives had drifted apart, and that spending time with Emily made him feel alive again, seen again, in a way he hadn't realized he was missing. Emily's chest tightened at his honesty, knowing this was exactly the kind of confession that could change everything, that could turn a simple friendship into something far more complicated, and yet she also felt a strange sympathy for him, understanding that human connections sometimes arrive at the wrong time or with the wrong person. She reminded herself gently that he had a life, responsibilities, and commitments outside her own, and that her role in this story should not become the cause of heartbreak for anyone, least of all herself. But Daniel's presence was magnetic, every glance, every subtle gesture, every quiet laugh made the line between right and wrong blur, and Emily noticed herself imagining moments she shouldn't, feeling warmth where there should have been caution, and longing for attention she tried not to crave. The conversation at the cafe deepened their bond. They laughed, shared worries, and even allowed small silences where no words were necessary, only the comfort of being near someone who understood them. Emily felt conflicted. Part of her wanted to pull away before emotions ran too deep, and another part of her wanted to stay, to feel the comfort of someone who saw her fully, not the version of her that always appeared strong and composed at work. Daniel's honesty about his marriage complicated everything further. He wasn't seeking Emily to replace Claire, he claimed, only to find a sense of clarity and connection that had been missing, but Emily could sense the vulnerability in his words, the tension between desire and duty. At one point, Daniel reached for his coffee, paused, and glanced at her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, and she realized that their attraction was mutual, subtle but undeniable, creating an emotional storm neither of them could ignore. Emily tried to steer the conversation back to safe topics, mentioning a book project and talking about future deadlines, yet Daniel always found a way to circle back to personal moments, sharing small details about his day, family, and life philosophy, making it impossible for her to remain indifferent. She felt a strange mix of exhilaration and guilt, knowing that each smile they exchanged, each story they shared, was building a bond that could lead to heartbreak if mismanaged. By the time the rain had stopped and they returned to the office, the emotional distance they once maintained had evaporated, replaced by a fragile connection full of questions and silent confessions. Daniel lingered at the elevator, watching her as if he feared leaving, yet knew he could not stay. "Emily," he said softly, "I don't want to stay away." His words struck her with clarity. This was no longer casual. Something had shifted in both of them, an invisible tether that neither reason nor moral logic could easily sever. Emily nodded slightly, her own emotions battling with her desire for stability, aware that giving in to feelings could make them vulnerable, Yet she also understood that denying connection might hurt them both in ways they could not anticipate. She realized that Daniel was not malicious, nor was she, but the situation was becoming dangerously emotional, creating tension and longing neither of them could fully explain or control. On the walk back to her desk, Emily felt the weight of every glance, every step, and every unspoken thought between them, knowing that they were both moving towards something uncertain, a precipice where desire, responsibility, and truth collided. That night, she returned home with a restless mind, thinking about his eyes, his words, the way he laughed softly at things only she could find amusing, and the strange comfort of feeling understood by someone outside her normal circle of life. She knew boundaries had been crossed emotionally, if not physically, and feared what might happen if Daniel continued to appear in her life with such honesty and vulnerability. Yet despite the worry and inner conflict, a small part of her hoped he wouldn't stay away, because in his presence, the world seemed lighter, more alive, and full of possibilities she had not allowed herself to imagine for a long time. That night, as Emily lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she acknowledged the truth: she cared for Daniel more than she should, and the feelings were growing, unpredictable and uncontainable, and she sensed that neither of them would be able to return to the way things were before this connection deepened. And just as she began to imagine how to keep her distance, her phone buzzed. Daniel had sent a short message, almost casual, asking if she was free tomorrow to discuss the manuscript over coffee, and Emily realized, with a mix of fear and anticipation, that the next chapter of their story had already begun. Emily didn't expect him to come that night, not after all the tension between them and the careful distance she had tried to maintain, but when a knock sounded at her apartment door, her heart froze, and she realized that Daniel had followed her home, standing there in the rain with a soaked jacket and a face full of conflict, and the sight of him made every caution she had tried to uphold crumble instantly. "Daniel? What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly as she opened the door, feeling the warmth of the apartment clash with the chill of the night, unsure whether to be angry, scared, or relieved. He hesitated, staring at her with eyes that carried exhaustion, guilt, and longing all at once, and he spoke softly, almost brokenly, that he had had a fight with Claire, that he had walked out because he couldn't face pretending everything was normal, and that he needed someone to talk to, someone who understood, someone who was her. Emily stepped back, trying to create space, aware of the danger of letting him into her private world, knowing that emotions could escalate in moments like this, yet feeling an undeniable pull to comfort him, to listen, to be the person he needed, even if it hurt her. Daniel's words were full of honesty and pain. He admitted that Claire had asked him if he cared about anyone else, and he had been forced to confront the truth about his feelings for Emily, and in that admission, Emily felt a mixture of shock, fear, and an emotional connection that was far deeper than anything they had shared before. She knew that she could become the reason for a fracture in his marriage, that her involvement could bring pain and misunderstanding, yet she also understood that he wasn't malicious, that he was struggling with emotions he hadn't anticipated, and that her role could be one of support without crossing the line into something destructive. Daniel remained standing in her doorway, drenched from the rain, and Emily noticed the trembling in his hands, the way his voice softened when he admitted he had never felt this seen or understood before, and that every word he said made her chest tighten as she wrestled with the undeniable attraction and emotional intensity that had been building between them for weeks. She tried to speak, to tell him to leave, to remind him that he had a life outside her apartment, a wife who needed him, and responsibilities he could not abandon, but before the words fully formed, Daniel whispered that he didn't want to leave, that he wanted to stay, that being with her, even in a conversation, even in a moment of shared vulnerability, was the only thing that made sense to him right then, and Emily felt the weight of the moment, realizing that this was no longer a casual emotional connection, but a turning point that could change both their lives forever. She placed a hand on her chest, feeling her heart race, and reminded herself that she could not be the cause of someone else's heartbreak, that she had to protect both herself and Daniel from choices that might seem right in the moment but destructive in reality, and yet she could not deny the comfort his presence brought, the way he looked at her with honesty and raw emotion that no one else had ever offered. They stood there in silence for a long moment, rain dripping off his hair, the apartment quiet except for the soft sound of the city outside, and Emily felt her emotions collide, sympathy, longing, confusion, and an undeniable spark that made it almost impossible to enforce the boundaries she had tried to maintain. Daniel finally spoke, voice low and sincere, admitting that he had said things to Claire that night, confessed truths he had hidden for months, and realized that the only way to face his life honestly was to confront his feelings, including the ones he had for Emily, and she saw the pain in his eyes, the struggle between desire and responsibility, and knew that this man was caught in an impossible position, torn between love, loyalty, and his own heart. Emily's own feelings were equally conflicted. She cared for Daniel, she had grown to admire and understand him in ways no one else could. Yet she knew that any decision they made in that doorway could have consequences she was not ready to face, and so she spoke softly, telling him to leave, not because she didn't care, but because she wanted him to choose what was right for himself, for his life, for the marriage that still mattered despite its cracks. Daniel's gaze lingered on her, full of pain, regret, and longing, and he asked what he should do if he couldn't fix things, if the truth of his feelings was too strong to ignore, and Emily responded with quiet wisdom, saying that the only way forward was honesty, not betrayal, and that whatever he decided, it should not be because of loneliness or temptation, but because it was the right choice, even if it hurt. He took a long breath, closed his eyes, and nodded, understanding that she was right, that he had to face his life honestly, and for the first time since she met him, he stepped away from her, truly stepping away, leaving the doorway open, the apartment quiet, and Emily standing there with a mixture of relief, sadness, and unexpected clarity. That night, as she watched him disappear into the darkness of the rain-soaked street, she realized that emotional bonds could be powerful, that longing could be intense, but that self-respect and moral clarity could guide people through even the most difficult of temptations, and she felt an unexpected sense of strength in knowing that she had helped him confront a painful truth without compromising her own integrity. Over the following days, Emily reflected on the encounter, the vulnerability he had shown, the confessions, the intensity, and realized that their connection, though real and deep, was a test of boundaries, of character, and of choice, and she knew that she had been a witness to a pivotal moment in his life, one that would shape both of them forever. The emotional storm that had raged in that doorway had passed, leaving behind understanding, maturity, and the quiet realization that love and attraction, though powerful, could not override responsibility and honesty, and that stepping back, though painful, was often the bravest act of all. She also realized that Daniel was not gone from her thoughts. The memory of that night, the truth of his feelings, and the subtle warmth of his presence would stay with her for a long time, a reminder that some connections are unforgettable even when they must remain unfulfilled. By the end of the week, Emily had regained a sense of calm, a renewed perspective on emotional boundaries, and a quiet pride in having navigated one of the most intense moments of her life with dignity and compassion, knowing that Daniel, too, had the chance to make choices that could heal rather than harm, and that their story, though unfinished, had taught them both lessons about desire, honesty, and the complexity of the human heart. And as she closed her eyes that night, she understood that sometimes, letting go, guiding someone to do what is right, and standing firm in one's own integrity can create a quiet, lasting impact, more powerful than any fleeting moment of passion or temptation could ever achieve. Emily Harper felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread as she opened the door to see Daniel standing there once more, drenched from the rain, his eyes heavy with emotion, and she realized instantly that this night was different from all the others, that whatever happened now could change everything between them forever, yet she also knew that she had to be strong, to think clearly, and to guide him toward the right choice without letting herself get lost in the intensity of their connection, and even though her heart beat fast, she took a step back and spoke with a calm voice, telling him that he needed to go home, not because she didn't care, but because she wanted him to face his life honestly and take responsibility for the marriage he had committed to deal with the struggles he couldn't ignore, and to understand that true connection required integrity, not escape. Daniel's face softened as he listened, a mixture of relief, sorrow, and admiration crossing his features as he admitted that he had been lost, confused, and caught between feelings he couldn't control and obligations he couldn't abandon, and Emily noticed the trembling in his hands, the vulnerability in his voice, the tension in his shoulders, all of which made her heart ache with compassion and something more, a deep understanding of the man she had grown to care about over the past weeks, yet she also realized that caring did not mean giving in, that loving someone sometimes meant stepping back and letting them make the difficult choices themselves. She reached out gently, placing a hand on his arm, feeling the warmth of his skin, the quiet tremor of his body, and whispered softly that he needed to repair what was broken, not because of her, but because of truth, honesty, and the life he had promised to build with Claire. And Daniel listened, his breathing slow, his eyes locked on hers as if searching for permission, forgiveness, or confirmation that choosing the right path could still be the right choice even if it hurt them both. Emily nodded, feeling tears prick her eyes, knowing that they had shared something profound, yet acknowledging that it was not meant to continue in the way they both might secretly wish, and that their connection, though genuine and deep, had to serve as a lesson in patience, morality, and understanding the limits of desire. Daniel finally took a deep breath, exhaling slowly as though letting go of weeks of confusion, admitting quietly that he had feared losing himself, losing his sense of honesty, and perhaps losing Emily too. And Emily responded with a soft smile, reassuring him that stepping away was not a defeat, but a courageous act, a decision to face reality rather than flee from it, and she felt a sense of peace in being able to guide him without compromising her own values or emotional health. They stood there for a long moment, the rain outside fading into silence, the city lights casting soft reflections on the floor, and Emily realized that this moment, though painful, was a turning point for both of them, a chance to rebuild trust in themselves and in the decisions that shaped their lives, while also acknowledging that emotional honesty could create a bond strong enough to survive separation. Daniel nodded, his expression showing relief and gratitude, and he finally stepped back, acknowledging that he would return to Claire with a commitment to repair their marriage, to communicate openly, and to rebuild the love and understanding that had slowly faded. And Emily felt a mixture of sadness and pride, understanding that letting go had been the bravest and most loving choice she could make, for both of them. Over the next weeks, she focused on her work, her routines, and her own healing, yet Daniel remained in her thoughts, not as a source of pain, but as a reminder of emotional truth, courage, and the depth of human connection that does not always need physical fulfillment to leave a lasting impression. She reflected on their conversations, the confessions, the vulnerability, and the moments of quiet understanding, realizing that love could be powerful, transformative, and pure even when it required patience, self-control, and moral clarity. Emily occasionally heard from Daniel in short, respectful messages, simple updates about the projects they had worked on, always professional, always kind, and she noted the subtle difference in his tone, calm, grounded, and honest, which reminded her that he was making the right choices, that he was learning to balance emotions with responsibilities, and that their story had evolved from temptation to mutual respect, emotional growth, and integrity. Months passed, and one day Daniel visited her office, not to linger, not to tempt, but to offer a simple, heartfelt thank you, and Emily smiled softly, understanding that this gesture was full of closure, maturity, and the quiet beauty of a connection that had changed both of them without destroying either of their lives. And she realized that emotional honesty, courage, and compassion could leave a lasting impact even when desire had been present. They shared a final moment of quiet understanding, a glance filled with recognition of the journey they had shared, the lessons learned, and the emotional bond that remained even as life moved forward. And Daniel walked away, finally at peace, leaving Emily with a sense of relief, clarity, and the knowledge that choosing the right path often required sacrifice, patience, and strength. That night, Emily reflected on the months of emotional intensity, the challenges, the longing, and the heartache, and she felt a quiet pride in herself for holding boundaries, guiding someone to face truth, and understanding that love, when handled with integrity, could transform people without crossing dangerous lines. And she smiled, knowing that both she and Daniel had grown emotionally, matured, and learned the value of honesty, patience, and respect, and that their story, though no longer a tale of longing or temptation, had become a lesson in the power of emotional connection, responsibility, and the courage to choose what is right even when the heart wants otherwise. By the end of the story, Emily understood that real strength was not about holding someone close against their will, nor about giving in to desire, but about helping people see truth, make the right choices, and grow into better versions of themselves. And Daniel, now calm and committed, had found a way to repair his life while cherishing the lessons Emily had given him without letting passion blind him. leaving both of them with emotional closure, wisdom, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that love, honesty, and integrity could coexist even when temptation and longing had once threatened to consume everything.
The morning began quietly in Maplewood, a peaceful town where the air often carried the scent of wet grass and pine. Margaret Hale, a silver-haired woman in her late 60s, stood in her small garden behind the porch, watering her roses just as she did every Sunday. She found comfort in that routine, the sound of water, the soft rustle of leaves, and the distant hum of life waking up around her. Since her husband Henry passed away 7 years ago, these small habits had become her way of staying steady in a world that often felt too silent. She was bending down to trim a few wilted petals when she heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway. She turned, frowning slightly, because she wasn't expecting anyone that morning. A sleek blue car came into view, one she recognized almost immediately. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw the young man stepping out. "Ethan," she called out, her voice rising in surprise and joy. Her grandson grinned, slinging a backpack over his shoulder. "Hey, Grandma." He looked taller, stronger than before. The last time she'd seen him was around Christmas, almost 6 months ago. Back then, he'd been a bit lost, still finding his path after college. Now he seemed calmer, though there was a new kind of weight behind his smile, something she couldn't quite read. Margaret hurried to him and wrapped her arms around his shoulders. "Oh, my dear boy, what a surprise. You should have called. I would have baked something special." He laughed softly, hugging her back. Then it wouldn't have been a surprise. She pulled back, studying his face. His eyes, gray like his grandfather's, held a gentle warmth, but she could see tiredness there too. "You look like you've been driving all night," she said. "Yeah, I left early. I just wanted to see you." That made her heart ache in the best way. Ethan had always been close to her, even more than most grandsons were. During his childhood, when his parents were going through their endless arguments and eventual divorce, he often spent weekends at her home. She became his safe place, his quiet corner of the world. Now, seeing him again as an adult, she felt both proud and a little nostalgic. "Well, come on in," she said. "Breakfast is still warm." Inside the cozy kitchen, the smell of cinnamon and coffee filled the air. Margaret poured him a cup and set a plate of pancakes before him. They ate together, chatting about ordinary things, his work at the design firm, his new apartment, his plans for summer. But underneath his easy words, Margaret sensed something unsaid. He laughed at her jokes, asked about her health, but his eyes wandered every now and then as if he was working up the courage to speak. She finally asked, "Gently, Ethan, are you sure everything's all right?" He hesitated, playing with his fork. Yeah, everything's fine. I wanted to spend a few days here. You don't mind, right?" "Of course not," she said, smiling warmly. "This house is always yours." He looked relieved, but still uneasy. She wanted to ask more, but decided to give him time. People, especially young people in love or trouble, often opened up when they were ready, not before. Later that afternoon, they sat on the porch together. The rain began to fall gently, drumming against the old wooden roof. The smell of wet earth filled the air. Ethan watched the rain with a faraway look, his elbows resting on his knees. Margaret noticed how grown-up he looked now. Yet how small he seemed in that moment, like the boy who used to come to her with scraped knees and secrets too heavy for his little heart. "Grandma," he said finally, breaking the silence, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course, sweetheart," she said softly. He turned to her, his face serious. "When Grandpa passed away, did you ever think about falling in love again?" Margaret blinked, startled. Of all the things he could have asked, that was the last she expected. "That's quite a question, Ethan," she said with a half-smile. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged, his gaze lowering to the floorboards. "I don't know. I was just wondering what it's like to move on, I guess." She looked out at the rain, her mind drifting back through the years. "It wasn't easy," she said quietly. "Henry was my world for a long time. Losing him felt like losing half of myself. After that, I thought I was done with love." "But you weren't, were you?" he asked, eyes searching her face. Margaret's lips curved in a faint, wistful smile. There was someone, a friend, much later. He used to bring me coffee every morning when I worked at the library. He made me laugh again, but life has a way of reminding us that timing matters. She paused, sighing softly. He moved away for work, and I never saw him again. Ethan didn't say anything at first. Then, slowly, he said, "I think I understand that." She glanced at him curiously. "Do you now?" He nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. "Yeah, there's someone I care about, Grandma. Someone people don't really understand." Her curiosity deepened, but before she could ask more, Ethan stood up suddenly. "I'll tell you later. I just needed to be here for a bit." Margaret watched him walk down the porch steps and stand in the rain, looking lost in thought. She didn't know what was going on in his heart, but she could feel it tip with something big, something that had brought him here not just for comfort, but for guidance. When he came back inside, his hair damp from the rain. She handed him a towel and smiled gently. "Whatever it is, Ethan, you don't have to rush. Sometimes the answers come when you stop looking so hard." He smiled faintly. "You always know what to say." As night fell, Margaret tucked an extra blanket on the couch for him and sat for a while by the window after he went to sleep. The rain had stopped and the sky was clear again. The moonlight touched the garden softly. She thought about his question about love, about moving on, and realized it still stirred something inside her. Even after all these years, maybe, she thought, love never truly ends. Maybe it simply changes shape. She turned off the lamp and whispered a quiet prayer for her grandson, hoping whatever he was struggling with, he would find peace and the courage to follow his heart. She didn't know yet that his visit was about to bring back pieces of her own past. She thought she'd buried forever. But for now, she was simply glad he was home, outside. The wind moved gently through the roses, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years, a quiet sense of beginning. The next morning began with sunlight streaming through the lace curtains, lighting up the kitchen in a warm glow. Margaret moved around quietly, making breakfast: scrambled eggs, toast, and orange juice just like she used to when Ethan was a boy. He came downstairs, rubbing his eyes, his hair messy, wearing that same sleepy grin she remembered from years ago. "Morning, Grandma," he said, his voice still rough from sleep. "Morning, dear," she replied with a smile. "You always look like you wrestled your dreams all night." He laughed softly and sat at the table. "Maybe I did." They ate together in silence for a few minutes, the kind of silence that felt easy, like a soft blanket. But Margaret could sense there was still something sitting on his mind. She watched him push his food around the plate instead of eating, lost in thought. Finally, she said gently, "Ethan, you've been quiet since yesterday. You can tell me what's bothering you, you know?" He looked up, hesitant, then sighed. "I will, Grandma. I just need to find the right words." She didn't press him. Instead, she poured him another cup of coffee and said, "Then find them over breakfast. Words are easier when there's coffee involved." That made him smile, and for a moment, the tension faded. But as they moved into the living room later that morning, Ethan grew thoughtful again. He started asking her questions about Grandpa Henry, how they met, what their marriage was like, how she knew he was the one. Margaret leaned back on the sofa, smiling faintly as memories filled her mind. "We met at a town dance," she said. "He stepped on my toes twice and apologized 5 times before the song ended. I married him a year later." Ethan chuckled. "Sounds like he knew what he wanted." "Oh, he did," she said softly. "And I did too. We built a life together, simple, not perfect, but full of love. He had this way of making everything feel steady." Ethan looked at her carefully. "You really loved him, didn't you?" "With all my heart," she said. "But love doesn't stop just because someone's gone. It stays, changes form, but it never truly leaves you." He nodded slowly, then looked down at his hands. "That's kind of what I wanted to talk to you about." Margaret tilted her head, sensing something important coming. "Go on, dear." Ethan took a deep breath, his voice trembling slightly. There's someone I've been seeing. Someone special. But it's complicated. Margaret's heart stirred with curiosity. Complicated how? He hesitated before answering, his eyes on the floor. She's older than me. A lot older. Margaret didn't speak at first. She could tell how nervous he was, how much courage it took for him to admit that. How much older? She asked softly. About 15 years, he said quickly, then rushed to add. But it's not like what people think. She's not trying to control me or anything. We just understand each other. She listens. She sees me in a way no one else does. Margaret stayed silent for a moment, studying his face. He wasn't defensive or ashamed, just uncertain, afraid of being judged. She remembered that feeling well. Does she make you happy? She asked finally. Ethan looked up, surprised. Yes, more than anyone ever has. Then that's what matters, she said gently. Not what people say. Real love is rare, Ethan. If it's honest and kind, don't let fear ruin it. He stared at her, eyes wide. You really think that? She nodded, her expression calm but full of emotion. I do. Love doesn't follow a calendar. It finds us when it wants to. He leaned back, exhaling in relief. I didn't think you'd understand. Margaret smiled faintly. Oh, I understand more than you think. He looked curious. You mean? You've been in a situation like that? She hesitated, then nodded slowly. After your grandfather passed, I met someone. His name was David. He was younger by almost 10 years. He used to come to the library to read. We talked every week about books, life, little things. He had a warmth about him, a kindness I hadn't felt in years. Ethan listened quietly, his eyes soft with empathy. One day, she continued, her voice low, he asked me to have dinner with him. I almost said no, I was afraid of what people would say. But something inside me told me to go. And for a while, I felt alive again. We never made it official. He got a job offer in Boston and left. We wrote for a few months, but eventually, life moved on. Her voice faded, and a bittersweet silence filled the room. I guess, she said, looking at Ethan with a tender smile, I was too scared to hold on to something that made me happy. Maybe I shouldn't have been. Ethan's throat tightened. Grandma. She reached for his hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. Don't repeat my mistake, Ethan. If she's good to you, if it's real, then don't let the world's opinions stop you. People love to talk, but they don't live your life. He swallowed hard, his eyes shining. That's exactly what I needed to hear. For the first time since he arrived, Ethan looked at peace. Margaret could see the change in his face, like a heavy weight had been lifted. He smiled softly, almost shyly. There's something else, he said. I've been thinking about asking her to marry me. Margaret blinked, surprised. Marriage. He nodded. Yeah, I know it's soon. We've been together for about a year. But she's everything. She's kind, grounded, and she makes me feel like I'm enough. I've never felt that before. Margaret felt a lump in her throat. She saw herself and him not, the young boy she once knew, but a man brave enough to love with his whole heart. Then you should tell her, she said quietly. Life's too short to hold back from love. If it's meant to be, you'll know. Ethan smiled, his eyes bright with emotion. I'm glad I came here. I didn't know what I'd say, but I needed to hear that from you. Margaret brushed a tear from her cheek and laughed softly. You came here for my advice, but I think you've reminded me of something too. What's that? He asked. That it's never too late to believe in love again, she said with a wistful smile. Ethan reached across the table and squeezed her hand. You still can, Grandma. Maybe you should. She laughed softly, shaking her head. One miracle at a time, dear. They sat there for a while longer, the sun now golden through the windows, casting a warm glow on both their faces. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the garden sparkled with drops of light. For the first time in years, Margaret felt her heart open again, not for the past, but for the beauty of love itself, the kind that refuses to die no matter how old you get. And for Ethan. That morning became a turning point, a quiet moment of truth that gave him the strength to follow his heart without fear. What neither of them knew yet was that this conversation would soon lead to a choice that would change both their lives forever. That evening, the air in Maplewood felt heavy with the promise of rain again. The sky was painted gray, and a soft wind rustled through the trees as if the world itself was holding its breath. Margaret sat by the window, knitting slowly, though her mind wasn't on the yarn. Her thoughts kept circling back to Ethan's words from earlier, the confession about his relationship, his plans to marry, and the courage it must have taken for him to say it out loud. She couldn't help but admire him. In a world where so many people gave up on love because of fear or judgment, Ethan was daring to hold on to it. It reminded her of something she'd lost long ago, the bravery to believe love could still be possible no matter the odds. Ethan entered the living room quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea. "Thought you might like one," he said with a small smile. She looked up, grateful. "You still remember how I like it?" "2 spoons of sugar and a hint of milk," he replied proudly. She chuckled. Good memory. They sat together in silence for a moment, sipping tea, watching raindrops trickle down the glass. The house was calm, the kind of calm that carried both comfort and meaning. Margaret could sense something else weighing on him, something he hadn't yet said. "You've been quiet again," she said softly. "Still thinking about her?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, I can't stop. She doesn't even know I came here. I just needed to be sure before I do what I'm planning." Margaret turned to him, sensing the intensity in his voice. "And what is it you're planning, dear?" He took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small black velvet box. Margaret froze for a moment, her heart catching in her chest. "Ethan," she whispered, "is that?" He nodded, opening the box to reveal a delicate silver ring with a tiny blue sapphire in the center. "I bought it 2 weeks ago," he said quietly. "I didn't tell anyone. I wasn't sure if it was right. Everyone around me keeps saying I'm making a mistake. That she's too old for me, that it won't work, that I'll regret it someday." He looked up at her with eyes full of doubt and longing. "But Grandma, when I'm with her, I feel at peace. I feel like I'm home." Margaret's throat tightened. She looked at him, the same boy who once came to her crying after losing his first pet. The same young man who had always searched for meaning in everything, and now here he was, standing on the edge of one of life's biggest choices. She took a slow breath and set down her teacup. "Ethan," she said gently, "let me tell you something I wish someone had told me when I was your age." He nodded, waiting. "When love is real, it doesn't ask for permission," she said. "It doesn't check ages or compare backgrounds. It simply finds you and stays. People will always talk, they'll always have something to say, but they won't be there in the quiet moments, the mornings, the laughter, or the heartbreaks. You will. So don't live for their approval. Live for what brings you peace." Ethan's eyes glistened as he listened. "But how do you know if it's real?" he asked softly. She smiled sadly. "Because it doesn't fade when things get hard. Real love doesn't run, it endures. That's how I knew your grandfather was the one. And that's how I knew, even after he was gone, that love doesn't die, changes shape, but it stays." Her words seemed to sink deep into him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rain tapping gently on the window. Then Ethan closed the box carefully and looked at her again. "I needed to hear that," he said. "I guess I just wanted to know you'd understand." Margaret reached out and placed her hand over his. "Of course, I understand. More than anyone else ever could." He looked at her for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "You know, Grandma, you're the only person I trust with this. I didn't even tell Mom or Dad." "Sometimes," she said softly, "the heart needs quiet counsel, not noise." They both laughed gently, and for a brief moment the weight of everything seemed to lift. But then Ethan's face grew serious again. "There's one more thing," he said. Margaret's brow furrowed. "What is it?" He hesitated. "She doesn't believe I'll actually propose. She thinks I'll listen to everyone else and walk away. I think she's scared too. That's why I came here. I wanted to be sure I wasn't just chasing something foolish." Margaret shook her head. Ethan, if she brings you peace, then it's not foolish. It's brave. And the world could use more brave love. He smiled at her words, a small tear forming in his eye. You sound like Grandpa, he said quietly. Her heart warmed. Then I must be saying the right thing. It's for the next hour. They talked, truly talked. About love, fear, and all the things that make life worth living. Margaret shared memories she hadn't spoken of in years. The first time Henry told her he loved her. The nights they stayed up dreaming about the future, the way he'd make her laugh even when they had nothing. Ethan listened like someone hearing a long-lost melody. You loved him deeply. Ethan said finally. I did, she whispered. But love doesn't stop at the grave. It stays waiting quietly inside us, ready to be found again if we let it. He looked at her with admiration. You really believe that? She smiled softly. I do. And maybe, just maybe, you being here is the universe's way of reminding me. Ethan laughed gently, shaking his head. You always make everything sound like a story. That's because every love is one, she said, her eyes kind. Some just end sooner than others. The rain had stopped by then, leaving the night sky clear and full of stars. Ethan stood and looked out the window. You know what? He said after a pause. I'm going to do it. I'm going to ask her. Margaret's heart swelled with pride. Then go, my dear boy. Tell her how you feel. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Make it. He turned to her, his eyes bright and full of determination. Will you give me your blessing, Grandma? The morning light broke through the curtains, painting golden streaks across the living room floor. Margaret woke early, as she always did, and began brewing coffee. The house was quiet, but there was a warmth in the silence, a sense that something good was waiting to happen. She thought about Ethan, about the ring he had shown her, and about the bravery in his eyes when he finally decided to follow his heart. It reminded her of the same courage her late husband Henry had once carried, the quiet, steadfast kind that built families and changed lives. She was stirring her coffee when she heard footsteps behind her. Ethan stood there, dressed neatly in a pale blue shirt, his hair brushed, his expression calm but nervous. Morning, Grandma, he said softly. Morning, dear, she replied with a knowing smile. You didn't sleep much, did you? He laughed under his breath. Not really. I kept thinking about what you said last night, about love not asking for permission. She poured him a cup of coffee and handed it over. Well, it's true. Love doesn't wait for perfect timing. It just needs honest hearts. He nodded, his fingers brushing the rim of the cup. I'm going to see her today, he said. I'm going to ask her. Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with pride and a trace of worry. Then go with a clear mind and an open heart. And remember, you don't need to convince the world, just her. He took a deep breath, nodded again, and smiled. Wish me luck. Always, she said, touching his arm gently. You have more than luck, you have love on your side. A few hours later, the house felt strangely quiet without him. Margaret sat on the porch, wrapped in a light shawl, staring at the garden. The roses were blooming again, their colors brighter than she remembered. She thought of Ethan as a boy, chasing butterflies between those same rose bushes. And now he was a man standing on the edge of his future. Time, she thought, was such a strange thing. It carried people forward whether they were ready or not. And yet it somehow brought them back too, just like Ethan had returned to her doorstep, searching for wisdom, for love's permission. The afternoon drifted by slowly. The clock ticked. The air smelled of freshly cut grass. Margaret tried reading a book, but her eyes kept glancing toward the road. Every sound, a car, a distant bark. A gust of wind made her heart flutter with anticipation. Then, just as the sun began to set, she heard the sound of tires on gravel. She looked up quickly, and there it was, the same blue car pulling into the driveway. Her pulse quickened. Ethan stepped out, and before she could even ask, she saw the answer written all over his face. His smile was wide, almost glowing. She said yes, he said simply. Walking toward her, Margaret's eyes filled with tears before she could stop them. She stood up, her hand covering her mouth. "Oh, Ethan." He wrapped her in a tight hug, laughing softly. She said yes, Grandma. She couldn't believe it at first. But when I told her I loved her and that I wasn't afraid anymore, she just started crying. Then she said yes. Margaret held him close, feeling her heart swell with a happiness she hadn't felt in years. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "You listened to your heart." He pulled back and smiled, his eyes shining. "I couldn't have done it without you. You gave me the courage to follow what's real." They sat on the porch together, watching the sun dip below the trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Margaret couldn't stop smiling. "Tell me about her," she said. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his voice filled with quiet excitement. "Her name's Laura. She teaches art at the university. She's funny, stubborn, and she makes the best coffee I've ever had. We met by accident, literally. I spilled a drink on her at a cafe, and she laughed instead of getting angry. I think I fell for her right there." Margaret chuckled softly. "Sounds like fate had a hand in it." "Maybe it did," he said, smiling. "She told me she didn't think I was serious because of what everyone else said. But when I told her about you, how you believed in love, no matter the age or the rules, she said she wanted to meet you one day." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes again. "I'd love that, dear. I'd love to meet the woman who made you this happy." Ethan looked out at the sunset, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Grandma, I think Grandpa would have liked her too." Margaret smiled softly, her heart aching with bittersweet joy. "I think so too. He always believed love was the one thing worth fighting for." They sat in silence for a while, both lost in their thoughts. The world around them seemed to slow down. The crickets began to sing. The air cooled and the first stars began to appear above. Ethan turned to her suddenly. "Can I tell you something else?" "Of course," she said. "I told Laura about the story you shared about the man who made you laugh again after Grandpa passed away. She said it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard. She said maybe you should try finding him again if he's still out there." Margaret laughed softly, shaking her head. "Oh, I wouldn't know where to start. It's been years." "Maybe that's what makes it worth trying," Ethan said with a playful grin. "You never know what could happen." She smiled, her eyes glimmering with warmth. "You sound like me 30 years ago." "Maybe that's where I get it from," he said with a wink. They both laughed quietly. And for a moment, the world felt light again. The kind of lightness that comes when you finally let go of old fears and open your heart to the present. As the evening deepened, Ethan stood up. "I should probably head back soon. Laura's waiting for me." Margaret nodded, standing too. "Go to her and promise me something, anything." "Take care of her heart," she said softly. "It's the most fragile and powerful thing in the world." "I will," he said, his voice steady. "And I'll tell her she already has your blessing." He hugged her again, tight and full of love. Then he stepped into his car and waved one last time before driving off into the fading light. Margaret stood on the porch long after he was gone, her heart full and her eyes glistening. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence didn't feel empty, it felt peaceful. She looked toward the old oak tree in the yard, the one she and Henry had carved their initials into decades ago. The carving had faded, but the memory remained, just like love itself, soft, enduring, unbroken. A cool breeze brushed her face, and she closed her eyes, whispering to the wind, "Maybe love never really ends. It just changes hands." The stars shimmered above, and somewhere in that moment, Margaret felt a gentle warmth, like an unseen hand resting on her shoulder. She smiled, believing it was Henry smiling too. As she walked back inside, she glanced once more at the glowing night sky. Her grandson had found his love. Her heart had found peace. And the house once lonely was full of quiet, joy again. Love had come full circle. And as the clock ticked softly in the corner, Margaret whispered to herself, "It's never too late to believe in love again."